Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be discussing a reading about strategic planning. It's called A Strategic Planning Process for Public and Nonprofit Organizations by John M. Bryson. So this study specifically, it's a paper on an academic study that was done. It analyzes strategic planning in a city environment and compares that to a public health environment. He talks about how strategic thinking and acting are really important, especially when plans change. So it's not only about planning ahead, but having that mindset of strategic mindset that you'll be able to change plans like that. An important part of planning includes understanding the purposes, rules, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So the first part of the planning process, as we'll see on future slides, is to really assess where your organization is and where you want to go, big picture. If you understand the rules of strategic thinking, you can apply this to new problems like oil crises, demographic shifts, changing values. So while you might start learning how to strategically plan with one specific plan in mind, you'll be able to apply that mindset to other problems within that organization. Or if you decide to switch careers or agencies and move somewhere else, you can bring that skill to your future team. Within strategic planning, organizations really have to develop a coherent, defensible basis for their decision making. So anyone on the team who makes a decision has to be coming from that same mindset, same set of values, and drawing back onto their mission to defend why they made that decision. The intention of strategic planning is to help public and nonprofit organizations respond effectively to new situations. So when you come up with these plans for big organizations, there'll often be several years looking into the future. So you not only need to be like well versed in that plan that you come up with of several years in the future, but things are going to change as time passes. So you need to be able to use your strategic planning skills to respond effectively to new situations. Strategic planning involves discussions by key decision makers and managers about what is truly important for an organization. A lot of the times in planning, there will have to be some decisions made about what to prioritize. We have a long list of things that we want to accomplish in nearly any organization. And sometimes we'll have to make really difficult calls between different aspects of the goals that we hope to achieve. So everyone needs to be on the same page about what the priorities should be in case that ever comes to the point where you have to make a decision like that. It's really necessary to have a structured process to identify and resolve important issues. So it shouldn't just be everybody coming up with their own solutions. The team should be together on this, discuss, these are our priorities. These are some strategic ways that we can make difficult decisions in the snap of a moment if necessary, or the process we're going to use if it's a larger decision, we have some time to think about it, to come back together. And in this specific way, this is how we are going to discuss it and how we will work together to come to a conclusion. These are the steps that are outlined for strategic planning. Of course, this process is going to look different depending on the organization at hand, depending on the problems at hand. So first, you're going to develop an initial agreement concerning the strategic planning effort. So you'd probably read a paper such as this one, or listen to a presentation such as this one, where somebody who's really educated about this process goes through and talks about this is the strategic planning that the professional from this paper would suggest, for example, or someone really educated with strategic planning, really experienced with it. And then the team can collaborate together to discuss any changes that they'd like to make it specific to their organization and make sure that everyone is on the same page, that they all agree to be a part of this strategic planning process. Next, you have to identify and classify mandates. So anything that's in your company policy, in your organization's policy, that you have to get done. Maybe you've pledged to some donors that this is what will be done with this money, for example. Sometimes the donors will put money in specific piles and say, you have to do this with this money, this with this money. So things like that would be classified as a mandate where you don't have much flexibility as to moving money around in that example. Next, you have to identify and classify the mission and values. Of course, this is one of the first things that you should do when you form an organization. So hopefully it's just going back to that conversation you had when you form the organization. What is your mission here? Identify the stakeholders, the people, group, organizations that you can place claim on that will be impacted by your organization's resources or output. Make sure you're considering how those stakeholders are going to judge the performance of your organization. As you're considering this mission, this value, you have to consider your stakeholders as part of that value. Next, you'll assess the external environment. So that's kind of what I was talking about. As things change over time, your plan might change over time. So perhaps in an example, maybe you're a city planner, you're looking at this 5-year plan that someone came up with 3 years ago. Maybe let's take the example of the coronavirus. That was a tragic event that could have thrown off that 5-year plan. So when assessing the external environment, you'll be assessing how the pandemic impacted that plan and how you're going to take that into account to make changes in the timeline or in the ways that construction might be done, and etc. You're also going to assess the internal environment. What are your organization's strengths and weaknesses? And this should also be revisited throughout the execution of the plan. Maybe you have somebody super strong in a specific position, and then that person decides to leave the organization. Well, then you might have listed some skill that that person had as a strength. And when you lose them, that's no longer a strength. So you might have to invest in some training for other staff members or seek out someone who has a similar skill set to refill that position. That's something to keep in mind. And next is to identify strategic issues, which has this whole slide about it. So you're going to identify what kind of conflicts might come up along the way. What, how, why, where, when, who. Describe these conflicts, describe each of these conflicts that might come up, because you're not only going to have one conflict along the way, you'll have a lot of conflicts. Describe them very concisely in about a single paragraph. Explain why the issue at hand is fundamentally a policy question, because in this example of strategic planning, we're really looking at, again, public and nonprofit organizations, as the title suggested. You're going to explain what might happen if the issue is left unsolved. So this is where that prioritizing might come in handy. If you know that if this issue goes unsolved, your project might fail entirely. That strategic issue should go to the top of your priority list. But if the problem at hand, if left unsolved, perhaps you could go back and solve it later, something you can put off for a little bit, and that might go a bit lower on the priority list. Most government agencies should use this thing called the direct approach. That would be transitioning from defining the mission statement straight into identifying strategic issues. So when we're looking at the mission, what might get in the way of achieving this mission? What boundaries, what barriers do we need to break down to make sure that we can successfully achieve this mission? And some organizations might choose to use a goal approach. So you'll establish several goals for the organization and then develop strategies to meet those goals before looking at what might get in the way of those goals. There's also the scenario approach, where an organization might picture itself at its most successful peak and then ask themselves, okay, how do we get here? What plan can we make to get here? And what might get in the way of us getting there to this most successful vision that we have of ourselves? So the next step in strategic thinking is strategy development. Then you'll create patterns of purposes, policies, programs, actions, decisions, resource allocation that you want to achieve in order to achieve your mission, achieve your goals, achieve this successful peaked version of your organization. You're looking for consistency in rhetoric, choices, actions. So you want to make sure that everyone on the team is super clear about what the strategy is, and they're on the same page to achieve the same goals as the leadership wants of the people in leadership positions of the organization are hoping for them to achieve. Part of this process will also include identifying practical alternatives for resolving these strategic issues. So in step 6, you might have been, of course, identifying those strategic issues. Now that you know what those issues are, how are you going to get around those issues? What can you do to break down those issues, those barriers, those boundaries? Let me maybe give an example of one of those. Say you have an organization that is geared at helping a homeless population. Maybe some of the strategic issues, something that might get in the way of you helping that population, maybe it could be some language barriers. If you're in a community that has a lot of people who don't speak the same language as most of the people who work for the organization, people who speak another language might feel a boundary to be reaching out to your organization for support. So you might, in this step 7, be thinking about, okay, well, how can we effectively reach people whose primary English language isn't English, for example? Should we hire some more staff who speaks some of the targeted languages that other people speak in our area? Should we invest in translators outsource those translators from another organization to spend a few days a week here in our office with us? Something like that could help. Should we invest in some training for our current staff to become more proficient in other languages? Those are some examples what you might come up with using the strategic issue you set forth in step 6 to create a plan in step 7, how you're going to actually break down that issue. So you're going to be working on eliminating those barriers that you identified in step 6. And you really need to be thinking long term. So of course, it's impossible to really predict the future, but look at the trends of what is happening externally from your organization, internally in your organization, and think ahead to how your mindset might change over time within the time frame of the plan that you're putting forth. This will go along with imagining the future of your organization. It's likely that the organization will not follow the exact steps of the strategic planning process in order. You're going to have to modify this process, do what works best for you, and circle back through this process multiple times as time goes on. It's also really important to involve diverse groups in the planning process. People with different backgrounds and experiences can think of different ways to solve issues. They can think of different strategic issues that people who haven't faced issues like that might not think of originally. Every time an organization establishes a new program, there should be constant reviews, reconciliations. Like I mentioned, how you should go back and review those strengths and weaknesses periodically. And as a team develops, hopefully they're just growing more and more strengths as they're growing to work together better as a team, as different team members' strengths are being pulled out over time. Strategic planning is meant to help create clarity in future direction. So if you're really sitting down and planning effectively, then everyone on the team should have a clear vision of what the organization's future holds. So we're going to go on to these case studies that demonstrate this forward thinking. These cities are not specifically named within this paper, so they're just called suburban city for case number 1. This is a successfully managed city. The team developed a mission statement, identified strategic issues, and developed strategies to deal with those issues. So exactly this planning process that we just discussed. One of the issues that they identified, just as an example, was a need to improve vehicle and pedestrian traffic within their city. So in order to address this issue and others, part of their process to involve diverse people within this planning process was to actually survey the households and businesses throughout the city about their thoughts. So that brings the pooling of who can have influence in this outside of just the bureaucracy or the public officials who are planning this, but opens it up to a diverse array of people who will actually be served by new vehicle and pedestrian traffic patterns. They also bring up this problem within the city where they struggled with, it was a problem with the waterways and clean water. And the city was actually able to fix this problem, but the residents of the city didn't really realize that the problem was fixed. Like they were still had this perception in their mind that the water was dirty. So it really took a huge part on the city to educate people about what they had actually done to solve this issue and why it shouldn't be an issue for them anymore before people were able to really trust that part of their city again. Part of another aspect that they discussed within this city was In the part of the strategic planning process where you are to create a mission statement, it can be really challenging. That's such an integral part of the organization. So it can be really challenging to find a mission statement that everyone on the team agrees is really strong. Like, this is what our city stands for. That's why I would definitely suggest coming up with that mission statement beginning of the organization. As soon as this team starts working together, if the organization didn't already have one. Case number 2 within this paper was a public health nursing service. The county executive director asked several units of the county government to try strategic planning. One of those that he asked was the public health nursing service. And this was located within the same state as case number 1, the suburban city, but not the same county. The nursing service attempted to control communicable diseases. That was one of their jobs, just to give a little bit insight of what they stood for, some of their mission and values. The stakeholders of their organization, some of them included the director of the service, the executive director, the director of the Department of Public Health. So those are some of the people that this public health nursing service would be answering to. These are some of the people they want to make sure they do a good job for. These will be people who determine their funding, perhaps. The nursing service was concerned that it might become unfunded because the main city hospital was becoming really successful, and they were considering starting an outreach program to start to go to patients' homes. And going into patients' homes was one of the main strengths of the public health nursing service. So, when developing a strategic plan, this nursing service asked themselves, what really is their role in ensuring the health of citizens of the country or the county? They really want to take the time to define that because that will help them to define their mission and values. One of the solutions that they came up with was they really wanted to reorganize and specifically state the duties of administrators versus supervisors. They saw this as a barrier for their organization really being successful and successfully serving their community. So they defined this as a strategic issue and wanted to handle it as one of their first priorities. This was just one of the many efforts that they decided to take to try to be more responsive to the community, to families, and to individual healthcare needs. They started these reforms and they were really successful, and the county as a whole actually decided to engage in the strategic planning process after this nursing service was so successful with it. And the nursing service even felt that they could have influence over the next executive director because of their success with strategic planning. Overall, to effectively develop strategic planning, you'll need some good leadership. Everybody can be a leader, but the people who hold those positions where they're gathering the team, deciding when these meetings are, deciding what's on the agenda for these meetings, they should be good leaders. They should be people who want to prioritize strategic planning. Some people might be transitioning from private sector work to public sector work. It's really important to keep in mind that you should have a different mindset for public sector planning than you might in private sector planning. As a leader, if you have the opportunity to become a leader in an organization that has an opportunity to engage in strategic planning, you need to make sure that you really involve all the people on your team to fully understand why you are going through with the strategic planning process and what the plan is, so that everyone is on board to completely enforce that plan. It's really important to research before creating any policy. So research such as this article is a good place to start. And of course, you'll want to do some research specific to your area of interest and your team. Thank you.